story of a clown. He ate some kids and controlled a whole town. Pops out of photographs, evilly laughs. I absolutely hate it when he smiles. Okay, welcome to the Happy Ever After Party. I am your host, Sam Logston, and this weekend I had the pleasure of watching Chapter 2 of It in theaters. I'm not going to be doing a review of the movie, although towards the end I'll probably throw in my 2 cents overall, but that's not really what I'm interested in talking about. Here at the Happy Ever After Party, we like to dive into folklore and mythology and fairy tales, and while it certainly has its own mythos based off of the works of Stephen King, I actually want to try to tie some of the imagery and concepts in it to folklore and fairy tales throughout the world. Full disclosure, I have tried reading it before. I didn't get very far the last time, in part because when I was younger, I had a terrible attention span. And I don't know if you've ever seen how thick the book of it is, or noticed how long the audiobook for it is, but it's dense. There's a lot to unpack, but that's also one of the reasons why I wanted to do this today. Because there's a lot of themes, a lot of really interesting overlapping ideas presented in the book, especially if you put it in the context of where some of the inspiration could have come from. I probably should have mentioned this in one of my other episodes, but I'm not an expert, I'm not a historian, I'm not a major, I'm just somebody who's very passionate about learning mythology and religion and folklore. And I think it's really interesting to apply it to something that's already pretty rich in its own mythology. So with that being said, I'm going to be talking about a few things that are in the movie, that are in the TV miniseries, and I actually want to start with something that is in the book that's really only hinted at in these newer movies. So if you haven't read the book, this is light spoiler territory for you, but it's not really it's not really a big spoiler on any of the major plot points that happen in the book or in the movies. So some of you might be familiar with Maturin, who is the giant cosmic space turtle in it, and I believe he also makes an appearance in the Dark Tower series. I have not read the Dark Tower series either, and as being a big of a King fan as I am, I'm a little disappointed at myself. But Maturin is this good light-bearing kind of entity, and from his shadow, Pennywise, was created. So you already have this cool contrast between light and darkness, and this constant need for balance between the two of them. And what's really interesting is there's a couple different folktales that I came across involving turtles, but almost every type of story with turtles has something to do with either the creation of the earth or creation of structures on earth. Probably not a major inspiration for Maturin, but in Chinese mythology, the 4 legs of the half-turtle, half-dragon Ao were used to prop up the sky after a water god had damaged the mountains that had previously supported the heavens. Hinduism, however, gives us the imagery of the world turtle, who has the world supported on its backs with the help of 4 elephants. Anybody who has read it, or any Terry Pratchett fans out there who like Discworld, this should sound very familiar to you. This is the primary influence of Terry Pratchett's imagery in Discworld. Now, the world turtle is part of the narrative surrounding the second avatar of Vishnu, called Kurma, who's described both as the tortoise that carries the earth, but also as a half-man, half-turtle incarnation. Kurma is also said to be the one who restores balance to the cosmos. Now, while this sounds like the main inspiration behind King's creation, especially given its relationship to Pennywise, I'm inclined to believe that he was more inspired by the northeastern woodland Native American folks. Similar to Hinduism, they have a concept of Turtle Island, originally just describing North America, but in later interpretations would be the Earth as a whole. The Earth is on the back of a turtle who carries it peacefully throughout space. It does not have the elephants helping it out, but there are various creatures of the earth that help keep the turtle afloat and gives it fresh soil and has fresh water for everybody. It's not so much a direct entity of restoring balance, but it is an entity that cares very much for the earth and its inhabitants. I think the combination of Hinduism's world turtle and the northeastern woodland native tale of Turtle Island and the overall idea of darkness forming from light that's seems to be a metaphor in so many world religions, that's a pretty strong foundation for this relationship between our cosmic turtle and Pennywise. Now, I do specifically want to mention that I wanted to look into Native American folklore, especially seeing how it ties in with the writings and the descriptions of King, because so many of his writings have Native American inspiration as a motif. You have these ideas of sacred lands and artifacts. Think Pet Sematary, The Shining, Dreamcatcher. Again, I haven't read the Dark Tower series, but I'm aware that it ties these narratives of King's books together, and that motif is in the Dark Towers as well. And even though you can definitely read a lot of King's books, and there's little hints and references to his other books in it, and the Dark Tower expands on that and expands on Maturin himself. But even if you just read a handful of his books, you can see some overlapping themes and motifs and imagery. Like I said, if you haven't read the book, this concept of the cosmic turtle just it seems a little strange. The TV miniseries makes no mention of him at all. The newer movie doesn't talk about Maturin directly, but there's a lot of scenes that have turtle imagery in it. So he's literally there in spirit to help the Losers Club. All right, folks, consider this a spoiler alert. From here on out, I am going to be talking about things that happen in the new movie, in the TV miniseries, specifically towards the end, and some major reveals about Pennywise, and kind of getting into some of the darker aspects of this character. So from here on out, consider yourselves warned. We were talking about this idea of a turtle and the symbol behind it. For anybody who has seen the TV miniseries, I'm sure you were just as disappointed whenever you found out that all Pennywise was this creepy but very silly looking stop motion spider. I remember being absolutely terrified of It Chapter 1, like to the point where I had nightmares, and I didn't get to finish part 1 of the miniseries and part 2 of the miniseries at the same time. I watched them on 2 separate days. So the first time I saw the second half of the miniseries, and I know so many people say it, but it's disappointing. Like it has its charm. Tim Curry's still awesome, but that spider just damn near ruined it for me. Needless to say, in It Chapter 2, they remedy it. If you didn't think that the spider was scary, and if you only sort of think that Bill Skarsgård is scary as Pennywise, but he could be a little scarier. Well, I got some good news for you. At the end, they turn him into a clown spider. A giant behemoth clown spider. It's like a centaur with several horrible legs. But I'll, like I said, I'm not going to be doing a review of the movie quite yet. Although I do want to bring up that spiders are also brought up a lot in these newer movies. Even before we see it in its true form, we have a scene where the characters as kids are in the treehouse, and Stanley wants them all to wear these little head caps to keep spiders out of their hair. And that becomes very important later. In the TV miniseries, spiders come up a lot. Beverly, in the TV miniseries, whenever her bathroom's covered in blood, and her dad doesn't see it, she just blames it on a spider. The little girl who gets attacked sings the Itsy Bitsy Spider. So it's sort of peppered throughout. So we have a lot of little tiny bits of foreshadowing of things to come. But I think overall, if you've never really seen the miniseries and you've just watched these newer films, it comes off as a terrifying surprise. But I do want to talk a little bit about spiders in mythology, because it's all over the place. You have very evil spider entities, you have neutral spider entities, you have benevolent spider entities. I'm not going to spend too much time on the less malicious interpretations, but what I will say is that myths involving spiders in a more positive light are either weavers, they're crafters, or they have an active hand in the creation of Earth. Now, you have figures like Anansi and Iktomi, who are both trickster spider entities. And while it's easy to make the comparison between those two with our spider clown, I'm not entirely convinced that that's enough reason for King to have made his monster take that form, especially considering Anansi and Iktomi, they're more neutral. If I'm going by the D&D alignment, Anansi is chaotic neutral, and Iktomi's, I'd say he kind of borders on chaotic good, depending on what story you are reading. Now, going to some grade A nightmare fuel, I'm going to turn my attention towards Japan. There are a few different malevolent spider monsters. The Umigumo is a kind of spider monster that spat strings out of its mouth to trap people, and is one that I've never heard of before until I was doing research for this. And when I read it, I immediately thought of It Chapter 1. And the scene where Bev is grabbed by those strands of hairy strings in the sink before getting doused with blood. I just thought that was kind of a neat similarity. However, there are two shape-shifting entities that I feel fall more in line with our Pennywise. Fans of Japanese culture or anime are probably familiar with the Jurogumo, spider demons who disguise themselves as beautiful women. And in classic lore, their true form was that of a spider woman who controlled fire-breathing spider and nightmare fuel. Just a little army of fire-breathing spiders. If you are planning on sleeping tonight and can no longer do so, I apologize for the imagery. The Tsuchigumo. Just full disclosure, Tsuchigumo, I have read, was used as a derogatory slur phrase in the far, far, far past of Japan. I'm thinking like feudalistic Japan. Now, whether or not that this is a very archaic insult, or if there's still relevant usage for this word as an insult. I'm really not sure. And since it's out of my realm of knowledge, I'm just going to refer to them as earth spiders. So these earth spiders were another kind of shape-shifting monster that could take the form of women or monks or other innocent-looking humans that were anything but. Now, the stories about earth spiders are pretty interesting, especially when comparing them to it. In most instances, the hero is able to tell that the monk or beautiful woman is a disguise, and upon slaying them with a sword, the human form would vanish, leaving nothing but a trail of blood. The trail of blood led to a giant spider demon. Now, not exactly like Pennywise, but in the miniseries and in the new movies, we do have this kind of unusual deconstruction of Pennywise where the losers go to defeat it, and at that point where they make the decision to take action and destroy it once and for all, it doesn't attempt to trick them with imagery anymore. And instead, it shows itself in its final form. So even though it's not quite the same, I do kind of like that idea of, being able to get past the imagery to see the monster hiding, essentially. That's pretty poignant. Now, going back to Native American influence, most spiders in stories had a positive role, most notably Spider Grandmother from the Hopi tribe. Now, the Hopi were in a different territory than the Iroquois League, which our northeastern woodland tribes would have been in. That's where we would have heard about Turtle Island. So, while the Hopi were probably not the inspiration for its true form, I did read that Spider Grandmother, this nice, gentle, creating, all-around good deity, would sometimes take a form of an old human woman, not unlike Pennywise in the book and movies. If you have seen or read any of it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When Beverly goes to her house that she grew up in as a kid, only to find out that her father has passed away and a woman living there now, Miss Kirsch. Miss Kirsch ends up being it, but for a very brief period of time, he takes this form of an older woman before scaring the living shit out of Beverly in this demonic, zombie-like, half old woman, half her dad's voice, taunting her. In the new movie, though, and this is something that I won't get into too much, but in this new movie, the way that the old woman looks isn't so much like this grotesque zombie, half grandma, half dad thing. It looks very similar to Gaelic pagan imagery of the crone. This like giant, older, naked woman. I think that it was a really cool move on the new movie's part to design Mrs. Kirsch's evil form like that, because it's such a subversion of feminine positivity. The entity that's taunting Beverly, who really hasn't had a good positive female role model in her life. That's one of the things that I love about this new movie is even though there's a lot of CGI and sometimes it gives me a headache, the actual images in there are terrifying and very well thought out. But getting back to our spiders here, the Seneca people, who were part of the Iroquois League, also had a tale about a giant spider who was seemingly impossible to kill. One day, a hero, according to the Seneca people's folklore, finds the heart of this giant spider. It kills it. This is how it ends. This is the end of it. You have this giant cosmic entity, and ultimately, after the heroes defeat it mentally, they are able to diminish the monster into a much smaller form and tear its heart out and destroy it. The way that the TV miniseries did it is so much more silly, but they also didn't dive into what it really is. The most we ever get is Tim Curry saying that, their tiny little minds won't be able to handle it, his true form. Which I think it was just a very easy cop-out of, look, we're running out of budget and you're getting a cheap spider monster. But this Seneca myth, I wouldn't at all be surprised to discover if this was a major inspiration for the end of the book, given that a spider is its true form. So I know spiders upset a lot of people. I'm sure there's a lot of arachnophobes out there. I'm going to talk about something that's not quite as terrible, and that's the myths and stories of monsters that eat children. The story of it, to me anyway, is a little bit subversive in this particular regard, because there's so many monsters and stories and legends that all deal with eating kids or attacking kids, but so many of them were used as cautionary tales that it was always been refreshing to have it be the kind of monster that it is, because it is not a cautionary tale necessarily, because his victims are innocent people. His victims are those who would be victimized by humans. That's significant, especially when we're comparing it to other children eating or cannibalistic stories. We have Pennywise tell us that he is immortal and he is the eater of worlds and of children. And already I can think of Kronos or Lamia or the countless other Greek gods eating kids. The disturbing number of Greek stories that involve somebody eating their own children or other people's children. But instead of that, I kind of want to focus on these cautionary tales that have been told. Most famously, and something that I'm going to be talking about at another time, Hansel and Gretel. They were abandoned by their parents before leaving that trail of breadcrumbs and running into this voracious witch. And some scholars point out similarities between the story of Hansel and Gretel and the Russian tale of Baba Yaga. If you don't know who Baba Yaga is, do yourself a favor and go image diving for her. You're not going to be disappointed. But I am going to point out that Baba Yaga, while predatory and is just absolutely a baddie, she goes after any kid who gets lost in the woods. The witch in Hansel and Gretel seems to be more of a reflection of the parents that left them, and in later versions of the fairy tale, it's not both parents, it's actually the stepmother who has an idea of abandoning them. It's sort of really unusual how over time it went from both biological parents being like, yeah, screw these kids, to it being, oh, you know what, they just had a wicked stepmother, and then they ran into a wicked witch. But in either case, the witch in that was supposed to be a reflection of the people who neglected the kids. So, interestingly enough, I would also want to think that either one of these witches could have been inspiration for Mrs. Kirsch, maybe just as much as Spider Grandmother. Tying into Richie's fears, that's in the book and in the miniseries of the Wolfman, I can't help but think of Little Red Riding Hood and how much Pennywise resonates with the big bad wolf. So, besides the obvious don't talk to strangers cautionary tale that so many people place on Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf disguises himself as somebody Red trusts. Go figure, another older woman. But the wolf also uses gaslighting logic to make Red doubt her own observations that something is very, very wrong. In the new movie, there is an absolutely heartbreaking scene of a little girl who Pennywise tricks to go under bleachers during a baseball game. And he, was like, oh, your friends call you Vicky, and I know that, so I must be your friend. And she's like, bah, Felicia, no, I don't trust that. So she tries walking away, and then he starts crying, saying how, oh, nobody wants to be my friend. No, they all laugh at the way I look. And this little girl has a birthmark on her face. So Pennywise was able to kind of use that sympathy against her, not unlike, oh, what big eyes you have, and oh, it's all the better to see you, my dear. As adults, we can kind of scoff at that logic, but these characters are children, and children think very innocently. Now, with all of those European fairy tales I just mentioned, a lot of them are cautionary tales of either obedience to parents or personal responsibility, and they're all ones that people are pretty familiar with. I couldn't find a lot of myths about child-eating monsters closer to the indigenous territories that I mentioned before. That being said, I did come across a tale of the basket ogress, whose tale originated in the Kwakwala-speaking peoples region. Think Pacific Northwest coast. The ogress wasn't very cunning, but I did want to bring her up because her death isn't unlike the witch in Hansel and Gretel. Both of them are tricked into being burned alive. Pennywise wasn't necessarily tricked, but his death was brought about by, first and foremost, group effort, power in numbers, power of friendship, and a battle of will and the battle of wits. I give the newer film, It Chapter 2, a lot of credit for bringing up something in the book that was glossed over in the miniseries, and that is the ritual of Chud. It's this this native people's ritual for combating the entity of Pennywise that involves just a giant, it's a battle of wits. It is psychological warfare on a very dramatic level. Now, while I do think that the newer movie could have gone into more detail about how exactly it worked, this is also the part of the book that a lot of people complain about because it's simultaneously really well detailed, but also way too overstimulating. So for the sake of American audiences, I can see why they left out a lot of details. So as far as talking about world mythology and folklore goes, I'm going to stop there. I don't like to think a lot of any one particular story influenced Stephen King's It. But the story itself is a bit of a monster mash. It's really fun to look at some of the possible ties it has, especially since the strongest part of it has really little to do with the monster itself, for me anyway. What really gets to me and why I think overall I liked It Chapter 2, it is a story about something a little bit deeper than just monster bad, let's go kill it. My 2 cents as far as the movie goes. It Chapter 1, I enjoyed. Any of the problems that I would have had with Chapter 1, I had with Chapter 2. I'm a very big horror movie fan, but in recent years, I've become very annoyed with jump scares. So It Chapter 1, while a very fun movie, the jump scares did get pretty annoying. I rewatched chapter 1 recently, and I made sure that I had it on subtitles and the surround sound was off. I kept the volume relatively low. Pretty enjoyable, but some of the scares weren't as effective because you didn't have that horrible, terrible jump scare music in the background with it. Some of it, chapter 2, was a little rushed compared to chapter 1. I think chapter 1 was a little bit more of a tighter movie. It could have been a standalone film. You didn't necessarily need the sequel to tie up any loose ends. But that being said, I'm really glad it did, because chapter 2 takes place when all of the kids are adults, and the kind of things that it taunts them for are very real, very visceral adult things. The scene in the beginning, I'm sure, has made its circuit around the internet, but the opening sequence of it, chapter 2, involves something directly from the book, where a gay couple is confronted by Derry's bullies, and they are beaten within an inch of their life. One of them is thrown over a bridge, and Pennywise finds him and kills him, mutilates him. It's very difficult to watch, but as a queer person myself, it was very refreshing to see this horrible, terrible act be committed by the villain of the film right after the victim had experienced the same kind of hatred just for being who he is. This is something that's a modern issue, and I think to have had that scene where the couple was brutalized, but it would just go after the bullies, and we'd have that, oh, look, he got his comeuppance sort of feel. I don't think it would be anywhere near as poignant. I think that would lose so much of what makes it such a horrible, terrible monster, because at no point do we have any sympathy for him. In chapter 1, he does a bunch of spooky things, but besides the murder of Georgie, he doesn't really do anything to really make us, the audience, fear him. And in this movie, he does absolutely nothing to warrant sympathy. So you have this monster who feeds off of the evils of this town, the fact that there's this outdated notion of what can and can't be tolerated being expressed by the citizens of Derry, and the victims of those outdated ways of thinking are also his victims too. So there's that direct connection of real world hatred making him stronger. And this monster doesn't just appear as these silly creatures, and it, chapter 2, certainly has some very, very silly moments. But Pennywise also uses, the insecurities of the adults against them. He gaslights them, he makes fun of their trauma, and he goes after people who are already victimized. And this is something that, if you look deep enough in it, chapter 2, if you look at the miniseries, if you look at the books, you will find that there's very little difference between the terrible monsters that turn vulnerable people into victims and Pennywise himself. And I think that alone is why I really enjoyed the second chapter so much, because it hit that note perfectly for me. The book, as much as I read it in the miniseries, there's almost a certain element of camp and ambition that's in those that I admire. But I think chapter 1 and chapter 2, I think they probably are my favorite version of this story because it does encapsulate that very complex idea so neatly and in such a relatable way. And that is all I have to say about It Chapter 2. So if you haven't already, well, I guess you didn't listen to my spoiler disclaimer, but if you haven't seen it already, it's still out in theaters as of the release of this podcast. But like I said, I enjoy this movie. You should go see it. Rewatch the miniseries if you're like me for a good laugh. That is all the time that I have for today. Happy Ever After Party is a Dreadful Pennies production. All music featured in this show is brought to you by icon8.com. In the description below, you'll find links to our website, to Twitter. We're now available on Spotify and Google Play. I'm going to be working on iTunes in the near future. I am your host, Sam Logsden, and remember, it might not be the end. It might not be happy, but you're always welcome to this party. Take care.